All right, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session of our Doctors for America Lunch and Learn. I'm Rohit Nand. I'm one of the members of the Drug Affordability Action Team with Doctors for America, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. The purpose of our Lunch and Learn series is to provide our 20,000 clinicians and trainees in our network with valuable learning opportunities to supplement their advocacy efforts. Our hope is that with these sessions, we can also provide the doctors and medical students in our network with an opportunity to connect with others doing similar work as they are. Just before we get started, just a few quick ground rules that we have for our advocacy grand rounds. There's no such thing as a stupid question. If anyone has anything, please take advantage of the Q&A feature. We'll be addressing any questions that are asked there in the second half of the session. And we'll also keep tabs on the chat, and please look at the chat as our wonderful DFA staff will be posting valuable links in there as well. And just a reminder with the questions to be mindful of the questions and comments that every individual at a different stage of their training in these sessions. And so this is the first step for some, and then continuing education for others. So we just ask that everyone's respectful and mindful, but open to all questions and comments. Just as a reminder, we'll be live streaming this event as well as recording it, and the materials will be available afterwards. So just as a very brief background, today we'll be discussing the controversial FDA approval of the new Alzheimer's drug Aducanumab, which is marketed by the company Biogen as Aduhelm. We'll be hearing from FDA experts and those who served as independent experts on the FDA advisory committee that discussed the approval for this drug. So now to introduce our speakers for today. So first, Caleb Alexander. He's a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and he's co-director of the Center for Drug Safety and Effectiveness, as well as a principal investigator at Johns Hopkins FDA Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. He's a member of the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drugs Advisory Committee that discussed the approval for this drug. Second, we have Madhav Thambisetty, who's a practicing neurologist with expertise in cognitive and behavioral neurology and sleep disorders, as well as blood biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. He was also on the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Advisory Committee that discussed the approval of this drug. And lastly, Holly Fernandez Lynch, who's a lawyer and bioethicist who's an assistant professor of medical ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at UPenn School of Medicine. Her work is focused on FDA policy and clinical research ethics. I'll now let our speakers briefly introduce themselves, as well as add any details of their involvement on this drug on point of view before we get started.
Thanks. I'll begin. Again, Caleb Alexander, professor of epidemiology and medicine, practicing general internist. I do want to mention just my standard disclosures, which are, in addition to having served as prior chair and a current member of the FDA's Peripheral and Central Nervous System Advisory Committee, I'm also a co-founding principal and equity holder in Monument Analytics, which is a healthcare consultancy whose clients include the life sciences as well as plaintiffs in opioid litigation. And I'm a past member of Optum RX's National P&T Committee. These arrangements have been reviewed and approved by Johns Hopkins University in accordance with its conflict of interest policies.
I can go next. Thank you, Rohit, for that introduction. I don't have very much else to add. I've researched Alzheimer's disease now for at least 20 years. I'm also a practicing neurologist. I primarily see patients at the Johns Hopkins Memory and Alzheimer's Treatment Center, where I'm an adjunct professor of neurology. I just want to add that I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest here. My views expressed today don't represent any official position of Johns Hopkins University, and they're my personal views. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Fernandez Lynch. Thanks also for that introduction. I am a lawyer and an ethicist by training and an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I have no clinical expertise in Alzheimer's disease, but my work focuses on FDA policy and clinical research ethics. So I've studied the accelerated approval pathway and will share thoughts today about the implications of using that pathway in this context and beyond. I have no relevant financial disclosures to share. I am an unpaid member of the NYU Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access Working Group, which I think is the only relevant disclosure for today's purposes.
Thank you, everyone. So just for everyone in the audience, as a brief introduction to the history of the approval of this drug before we get started with our questions to our panelists here. So Aducanumab was approved on June 7th for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Even before its approval, multiple clinicians as well as medical professional societies, including the American Geriatric Society, called for the drug to not be approved. In November 2020, the FDA Advisory Committee nearly unanimously called for the drug not to be approved. 10 voted against approval, 1 was uncertain, and none voted in favor, after extensive review of the clinical trial data and the presentations from both Biogen and the FDA. Yet, despite all of that, on June 7th, the approval went ahead in a surprising way. So that's just a very brief history on that. So I'll start us off with Dr. Alexander. Can you kind of walk us through what exactly happened here with this approval, and what was your reaction when it first got approved?
Well, ultimately, I mean, to sort of jump to the end, to begin at the end of the story, at least the approval story, the product was ultimately approved using an accelerated pathway rather than a standard review. And so I was a member of the advisory committee that met late in 2020. And the advisory committee was primarily reviewing the evidence base to support the clinical efficacy of the product, of aducanumab. And this was a product that had a futility determination midway through 2 nearly identically designed randomized trials. The product was resuscitated in some sense from that determination of futility, and instead additional data was analyzed. One of the 2 pivotal trials was negative. There was no evidence of the product's efficacy. The other trial suggested a modest effect, but statistically significant effect. So a modest statistically significant effect in one of 2 treatment arms. And the committee was asked whether or not the committee felt that there was substantial evidence of efficacy. This is important because this isn't just a willy-nilly concept. This is a legal and regulatory term of art. In other words, substantial evidence of efficacy is required for market access in the United States under our food, drug, and cosmetic law. And so the committee was asked a fairly easy question, and that's why there was such almost unanimity. There was remarkable consensus among the committee members that the clinical evidence just wasn't there. And so, ultimately, this product, as I think, Holly, as you nicely put it last week, this product was rescued by the FDA using an accelerated approval. In other words, the product was approved not based on its clinical evidence, which the FDA apparently acknowledged, implicitly at least, just wasn't there, but rather on the potential, rather on the product's ability to lower levels of beta amyloid in the brain. In other words, beta amyloid serving as a surrogate for the clinical outcomes that patients and caregivers and clinicians ultimately care about.
Thank you. So Dr. Thambisetty, we're also now seeing that payers and health systems are making decisions on whether to offer this drug. Blue Cross Blue Shield and the Cleveland Clinic, as well as Mount Sinai Health Systems, have all said that they will not offer this drug based on currently available evidence around its safety and efficacy. Some have criticized this, saying that we're denying patients to potentially beneficial drug. As a practicing neurologist and Alzheimer's researcher, what do you think about this?
I faced this dilemma 2 days after approval of Aducanumab when I was in my clinic. And I was seeing a 75-year-old gentleman with fairly advanced dementia, whose main caregiver was his son. And this was, of course, prior to revision of the prescription label for the drug, which is currently now specific for mild cognitive impairment and mild Alzheimer's dementia. So as opposed as I was to the approval of the drug, and as convinced as I am that the approval was not based on sound scientific principles, I feel morally obliged to offer the treatment, now that it's been approved, to offer it to any eligible patients in my clinic. But in doing so, I make sure that I present in as non-technical language as possible the reason why there's so much of uncertainty about the clinical benefit of the drug, why the approval itself was so contentious, present the risks associated with the drug, and then eventually allow the patients and their caregiver or family members to make an informed decision. And I think we'll get into the details of how you determine who an eligible patient is later on during the discussion, but that's in essence how I've resolved this tension between my perspective as a practicing physician versus that of an Alzheimer's researcher or a scientist who's been able to take a deep dive looking at the data itself.
Ms. Fernandez Lynch, in defense of their approval, the FDA officials as well as Biogen have repeatedly stated that the accelerated approval pathway was appropriate for this drug. The accelerated approval has an interesting and tangled history. Can you kind of walk us through a bit more on what your thoughts were on the usage of this pathway to approve this drug specifically?
Sure. So we've heard a little bit already from Dr. Alexander about kind of the traditional standard for FDA approval, which is a demonstration that the product is safe and effective for its intended use. And typically the way that you would go about demonstrating that is that you would have at least 2 adequate, well-controlled trials that are evaluating the drug against a clinical endpoint, right? Meaning how the patients feel, function, or survive, right? Those are the things that really matter to patients when they are taking a drug, right? Is this actually going to work in a meaningful way for me, right? As opposed to, clearing amyloids, shrinking tumors, or other things that may not necessarily be linked to the outcomes of interest, okay? Now, the problem is sometimes if you're going to do a study where you're evaluating a clinical endpoint that could take a very long time to reach, you end up potentially limiting patient access to a product that could potentially be helpful to them during the process of studying it. Now, back in the early 90s, HIV patient advocates pushed FDA saying this process will take too long, right? If we have to study all of the drugs to figure out whether they actually improve survival, many of us might die waiting for that. Can't we do something more quickly? And so the response from Congress was to give FDA the authority to use an accelerated approval pathway for new drugs. You still have to demonstrate that they are safe and effective, but rather than demonstrating that they're effective against a clinical endpoint, you can use what's called a surrogate endpoint, right? Now, again, that's the amyloid hypothesis in this scenario. There's nothing inherently wrong or bad about surrogate endpoints. The problem in the accelerated approval context is that you can use unvalidated surrogates. And what that means is we think they're likely to predict clinical benefit, but we don't know for sure. And sometimes they don't pan out to actually demonstrate clinical benefit. And there's a lot of debate about what counts as reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Right here, we have a lot of debate about what does it mean to actually clear, the brain of these amyloid plaques. But it's intended as a trade-off, right? FDA can grant approval more quickly, and then the company is required by law to do follow-up studies to actually demonstrate that there is, in fact, a clinical benefit. The problem, though, is that those confirmatory trials are often delayed, right? So Biogen has been given 9 years to produce their final report on aducanumab. And it can be difficult to convince patients to be in those studies if they can get their clinicians to prescribe the product outside of a trial, and if they can get their insurers to pay for a product outside of a trial. And it can be hard for FDA to actually pull a product back. They have the legal authority to do that, but if there are patients and clinicians who are in favor of keeping it on the market, it becomes a politically contentious thing to do if the company fails to complete their trials, or even if those studies fail to demonstrate a clinical benefit. So we have this trade-off in our statutory scheme, but the evidence for how this pathway has been used in other disease areas, most commonly in cancer, has actually raised a number of red flags about whether the trade-off is actually bearing fruit, and whether companies are having their feet held to the fire enough to actually demonstrate clinical benefit.
Dr. Alexander, so Ms. Fernandez Lynch just kind of mentioned some of the history of this approval pathway with cancer, but can you kind of speak to the history of if this has been used previously, especially in your space, and what the history behind that has been?
Well, I think that and I should have said at the outset, but I've worked with the FDA for more than 20 years, and they do incredible science and get and incredible regulation. And there's a reason that they are well regarded around the world for that work. So I think it's precisely because of the FDA's careful work in so many contexts that this case is so hard to reconcile, and that this case sort of stands in stark contrast to that. So I just want to note, that this is truly an outlier, but unfortunately it's an outlier in the worst possible way. So with respect to accelerated approval, what we've heard from advocates of this product is in part, well, many products are approved with accelerated approval. True, but most of these are not products that have failed clinical trials that were powered for clinical endpoints. In other words, this isn't an instance where we have a proposed surrogate and we're doing the right trials to understand whether there's a clinical benefit are implausible. In fact, those clinical trials were done. And that's exactly what the FDA Advisory Committee reviewed and determined that there simply wasn't evidence to support the substantial efficacy of this product. So I think that the analogy for accelerated approval breaks down for many reasons. That's one of them. I mean, that's the real elephant in the room. You can also look at the number of studies of amyloid products that have failed. Here again, you will hear from advocates of the product that and its approval that, well, this product is different, that this really knocks amyloid out of circulation, or really takes it out of the brain, or this is really targeting earlier patients, or there's 5 or 7 different theoretical reasons that this product may differ from the more than 24 other products that have been developed to test the amyloid cascade hypothesis. But we don't approve products based on theory. We approve products in the United States based on evidence. And I think that that's what Americans can and do expect. So, the failed study of aducanumab, one of the 2 pivotal trials, demonstrated significant reductions in amyloid with no corresponding clinical gains. That's simply hard to explain. And the FDA's own biostatistical reviews call into serious question whether or not there's any correlation between reductions in amyloid on the one hand and gains in clinical performance on the other. No one goes to bed at night wondering what their beta amyloid level is. And so I think that it's simply hard to accept the fact that we may be waiting until 2030 to understand whether this product is even safe or effective.
So among the controversies with this approval, one of them was the broad label applied to the drug that diverged from the initial individuals who received aducanumab in the clinical trials. And then in response to criticism, the FDA changed made a change to that label. Ms. Fernandez Lynch, can you talk about what the FDA label change actually means? Is prescribing the drug for patients outside of those who are diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment or early stage Alzheimer's disease now off-label?
Yeah, this was a really remarkable, I mean, amongst the many remarkable features of this approval, the labeling change coming, just 1 month after the initial label was released was quite surprising. The label originally said that Aduhelm was indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, and then went on to not talk about the specific patients that were included in the clinical trials. And the revised label continues to say Aduhelm is indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, but the new language adds that treatment should be initiated in patients with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia stage of disease, and acknowledges that that's the population of patients in which the drug was initiated in clinical trials. And then it goes on to say that there are no safety or effectiveness data on initiating treatment at earlier or later stages of the disease than were studied. And that's relevant in particular because after the product was initially approved in June of this year, there were people from FDA who said, yes, we know that this was the population that it was studied in. However, based on kind of the science and biology, we would anticipate that the product would have efficacy, regardless before or after the population in the clinical trials. So that caused a lot of confusion. People were really worried about the broad labeling because obviously that would expand the population of patients who might be eligible to receive this product. It would expand the types of patients who would ask their physicians for it. It would expand the population of patients who would ask their insurers to pay for it. And so there was a lot of pushback on the label. I have gone over this label kind of again and again to try to figure out how much narrowing does it actually do. If it got rid of that first sentence that Aduhelm is indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, I think many people would be happier with the narrowing of the label or would feel like it was a true narrowing. With that sentence remaining in there, I think it remains, as it says, indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease very broadly. And why does this matter, right? I mean, physicians can prescribe products off-label. Once FDA approves a product for any indication, it's up to, physicians within the practice of medicine to decide how they want to use it. Well, it matters for two reasons. It determines how Biogen can market the product, right? Can they market it exclusively to patients with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, or can they market it more broadly for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease? I think the answer to that question is they can market it more broadly with this label. They have said that they won't. However, we know that they have already initiated, an advertising campaign in which people can take a quiz about their cognitive impairment, and no matter how you answer that quiz, they suggest you should talk to your doctor about initiating treatment, right? So the marketing question, I think, remains pretty broad. Having a narrower label also is helpful for payers to decide what they are willing to pay for. And here, it kind of goes both ways, right? It's indicated for this broad label, right? So that goes in favor of patients who were not within the trial population saying, we want you to pay for it. On the other hand, there is an explicit statement saying there's no data that would support using this product at earlier or later stages of disease. So I think we're just going to have to watch this one and see what insurers do. But I think the marketing can continue to be broad and physicians can prescribe it however they see fit.
Dr. Thambisetty would also like to hear your thoughts on this, as well as what you think about how the label change affects clinicians and how it's affected your practice.
So in my own practice, my hospital is working on guidelines to limit the drug to patients who are identical to those who were enrolled in the 2 phase 3 trials. So you can actually go on clinicaltrials.gov and look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria for both the phase 3 trials, Engage and Emerge. And those criteria are fairly detailed. So you have 8 specific inclusion criteria and 11 exclusion criteria for patient enrollment. The prescribing label is remarkably silent on all of these. The inclusion criteria for the trials were specific in terms of defining how mild the symptoms had to be. So you had to have patients with MMSE scores of between 24 and 30 or CDR scores of 0.5. The exclusion criteria cover a variety of serious issues, such as patients on anticoagulations were not eligible to enroll in the trial. Patients with a history of transient ischemic attacks or stroke for the last 1 year preceding the study were again not eligible. MRI screening images with evidence of more than 4 microhemorrhages or even 1 lacunar infarction more than 1.5 centimeters. They were all exclusion criteria. The label is remarkably silent on all of this. The label does not even insist on demonstrating brain amyloid positivity as a criterion to administer the drug. It is completely silent on the need for ApoE genotyping, which becomes very important in the context of presenting precise estimates of the risk for adverse events such as amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. So, the way I think of it is, if the label was a soundtrack, you would just hear, crickets chirping. It's very silent on all of this. And so, given the unproven clinical efficacy of the drug and virtually no safety data in real-world settings, I think it becomes really important that we select patients who are least likely to be harmed by the drug, as it is rolled out in clinical settings that are far less controlled than in the clinical trials.
So I just want to, I totally agree, and just want to underscore for people, keep in mind that, again, elevated amyloid is how this product works, and it was a requirement to get into the trials, and the label doesn't stipulate that you have demonstrated elevated amyloid levels, and yet half of people with mild cognitive impairment don't have elevated amyloid levels, and up to a third of people with a presumptive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease don't have elevated amyloid levels. So, I think of all of the missed opportunities for the label to better align with the clinical evidence, that is the real shocker and the real headline. I mean, not to require the demonstration of elevated amyloid levels is simply, I don't get it. I haven't heard a good explanation from the FDA or Biogen, and it just doesn't make sense. The other point I want to make, and it's music to my ears as a pharmacoepidemiologist to hear, of your healthcare institution and sort of the expectation that all of these criteria will be met. But it is really hard for hospitals and provider groups and health systems and payers to institute these processes. And so, we have history is rife with examples of products where there's non-specific use, or where there is overuse beyond the context or beyond the evidence base, even in settings where we have specific criteria that have to be fulfilled. So my point is just that I think that payers and providers, caregivers and patients themselves are really facing a huge battle here to ensure that as you, I think, nicely put it, Madhav, that patients are selected so as to minimize the potential harms from this product.
So along with this approval and the kind of media coverage we're seeing with the controversy, we're seeing some initial marketing efforts from Biogen, including avenues like the New York Times. Dr. Thambisetty, can you kind of speak to when you saw these ads and like reviewing them, what your thoughts on them were?
Sure. So I think we are seeing a well-planned and aggressive direct-to-consumer marketing effort. And I've written about this in some detail recently. So the paid post that you're referring to in the New York Times is paid for by Biogen, and the content is created by the brand marketing arm of the New York Times. To my mind, it's really a case study in misleading and inaccurate information. It seeks to greatly broaden the definition of who is at risk for mild cognitive impairment. And for me, the most glaring example was the rather emphatic claim that 1 in 12 people over 50 years has MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. Not may have or likely to have, but has. The Alzheimer's Association, in a recent Facts and Figures report in 2021, estimates that about 8% of people 65 and older may have MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. And important caveats attached to this are that these are indirect estimates from small studies that collected amyloid biomarker data. So we will need population-based studies and amyloid biomarkers for exact estimates. So it looks as if that number of 8% has been somehow appropriated into this estimate of 1 in 12 over 50 years. So transferring the same risk, but to a substantially younger population, and who are likely to be healthier and therefore potentially able to stay on the drug for longer once they're on it. The website also warns that Alzheimer's can begin up to 20 years before symptoms show up. The ad links to a supposedly educational website that's supposed to provide informational resources on MCI. The website is called itstimeweknow.com. There's, of course, a companion Facebook page as well. And as Holly just alluded to, you can take a symptom quiz. There are 6 questions. They all ask you questions like, do you struggle for a word every now and then? Do you forget appointments? Do you lose your train of thought? And so on. And whether you answer very often or never to all of the questions, the final recommendation is always to ask your doctor if cognitive screening is right for you. You can then search for an Alzheimer's specialist or a supposedly Alzheimer's specialist, where you can punch in your zip code, and the website returns a list of Alzheimer's specialists. I was surprised that one of the centers I was recommended was a rheumatology clinic. Now, don't get me wrong, I have the highest regard for my rheumatology colleagues. I'm sure some of them also take a passing interest in the brain. But of all the specialties you could refer a patient with memory problems to, rheumatologists really wouldn't be at the very top. But I think what's important here is that rheumatology clinics have tremendous experience in infusions. And so that's exactly the reason why you have rheumatology clinics in the list of supposedly Alzheimer's specialist centers, because Aduhelm is administered through an IV infusion. It doesn't stop there. You can find also the nearest center that you can go to get a brain amyloid PET scan. And for those of us who are more free-spirited or adventurous, you can opt to get a lumbar puncture instead and get your CSF levels of amyloid measured. There's absolutely no mention on the website about the substantial number of MCI patients who may remain stable without symptom progression for years, or even revert to normal if they have a treatable cause for cognitive impairment. In patients with MCI, the rate of amyloid positivity is between 25 and 40% between 50 and 65 years of age. And given that the approval of Aducanumab was based on a surrogate endpoint of lowering brain amyloid rather than any clinically meaningful effects on cognition and function, it's clear that this campaign is aimed at targeting the largest patient population with very mild symptoms who have no functional impairment whatsoever, and have them start and stay on the drug in the false hope that it may prevent Alzheimer's disease. And I think, as physicians, this is a timely reminder that we must educate our patients and ensure that we limit the misinformation. I found it somewhat striking that this paid ad in the New York Times came out, I think, a couple of days after the Surgeon General's health advisory about misinformation related to the COVID pandemic. And the advisory says limiting health misinformation is a moral and civic imperative that will require a whole of society effort. And he could have just as well been speaking about Aducanumab and this marketing campaign that we're now witnessing.
Thank you. Ms. Fernandez Lynch, can you speak to the role patient advocacy groups had in the FDA approval process and afterward that they can have and did have on disseminating information to communities?
Sure. I mean, there's lots of different types of patients, right? You have individual patients and you have caregivers of those patients, and then you have kind of big national organizations that are intended to represent the interests of patients. And so what happened in this scenario was that after the advisory committee met and voted against granting approval for this drug, the Alzheimer's Association reached out to FDA and said, we feel like the patient voice has not been adequately heard in this context. Now, advisory committee meetings do have the opportunity to hear from the public, including patients, but the Alzheimer's Association requested a meeting with FDA, which they were granted. They brought several patients along with them. And I don't know exactly what transpired at that meeting. I wasn't there. But what I do know is that the members of FDA have publicly responded in defending their approval decision to say, we heard from patients that they were willing to accept some uncertainty around this approval. That's what accelerated approval is for. We acknowledge that we don't know whether this product will have a meaningful impact on clinical benefits, but patients are desperate. There are not drugs that are meaningful treatments for this disease, and they are willing to try something. Now, that is not unique to the Alzheimer's context, right? Patient willingness to try in the context of desperation. But FDA is supposed to play a gatekeeping role. They are supposed to say, look, of course we understand that patients want, promising new therapies to be made available to them, but this isn't it, right? Given the data that we have, this is not promising enough. Patients really need FDA to be making sure that they are approving products that are actually effective, and not rescuing products for which the clinical evidence is not there to support. Now, you have to think about the difficult political position that FDA is in, right? Nobody is telling FDA, slow down, right? Hold off on these approvals. You have congressional pressure to go more quickly. You have patient pressure to go more quickly. And FDA is supposed to stand in and say, look, right, the science isn't here, the data aren't here to support this approval. And it's not only that FDA is playing a paternalistic role, right, saying to patients who have no better options, don't take this risk. But what FDA's approval process is really helpful for is forcing companies to produce the evidence that patients and clinicians need in order to make informed decisions. So if you think about this from a business perspective, Biogen's interests are getting their product on the market as quickly as possible and maximizing their profit and their return for shareholders. I don't mean to suggest that they don't also, they would love to benefit patients, right? But they have a profit-oriented goal, and as do other companies, right? And so they are going to do kind of the bare minimum that is required for FDA approval. Once their products get on the market, their incentives to keep studying those products and gathering that evidence fall right off a cliff, because it's not going to be particularly helpful to them, right? These further trials, once the product is on the market, really can do damage to the company, right? And if insurers are willing to pay and prescribers are willing to prescribe, they have very little motive to get the evidence that patients and clinicians need. That's why this gatekeeping role is so critically important that FDA holds. I don't mean at all to suggest that FDA shouldn't be listening to patients' perspectives. Of course they should, right? We've heard a lot over the past year and a half that FDA should follow the science. Yes, of course, FDA decisions should be, informed by the science, but the science is rarely going to actually make the value judgment about whether benefits are, outweighing risks. That's something that FDA has the discretion to do. Patients are stakeholders in that decision, listening to patients to better understand what does it mean to you in your daily life to move up, half a point on this 18-point scale, for example. Hearing from patients and caregivers about that kind of thing, I think, is actually really, really important. But what I'm trying to articulate here is that FDA cannot replace its approval standard with a patients were willing to try it standard. If we do that, we really run the risk of not having companies generate critically important evidence about whether their products actually work.
Thank you. So I want to save enough time for audience questions here. And this first question ties into one of the questions I was going to ask, which is on the advocacy side of things. So from a question from the audience here to anyone is there anything physicians can do who don't want to prescribe this drug to influence CMS to not pay for it? And the analogous side to that from the advocacy general standpoint, given the monumental costs this could have on CMS and the controversy that surrounds this, what can be done now and long-term to protect patients?
I mean, those are two different matters. I mean, if you don't think CMS should pay for this, speak out and make your voice heard. But if you're a practicing clinician seeing patients with Alzheimer's disease, these are waters you got to swim in. I'm a practicing internist. I have patients with Alzheimer's disease. Clinicians and patients will navigate these waters with caregivers, and I think do so generally well, but they're complicated. We shouldn't be in this position, but that's after the fact. And the horse is out of the barn now in terms of the exam room. So I guess I would separate sort of how a clinician should go about this in clinical practice, where my answer is carefully informed by the evidence, with models of shared decision making, although I wouldn't overstate the role that clinicians have in framing and guiding decisions in all cases, let alone in this type of case. But I think that that's separate from the matter of sort of, should CMS cover this and under what circumstances? And, if you're part of a health system that's debating whether to go the way of the Cleveland Clinic and elect not to administer this or not, should your health system do that? I think speak out and let your voice be heard.
I just to add a couple of points to both those observations. I think there's also a tremendous opportunity that we now have, given where we currently are. I think it's unacceptable to wait until 2030 before we know, if there's any real world clinical evidence or not. So I think there are opportunities where I think physicians, patients, caregivers can all come together and say, look, let's mount a citizen science movement. Let's try and get real world clinical data, given the current circumstances, and try and get it as quickly as possible. And this might likely call for innovative thinking, even for pragmatic clinical trials. And there are some examples out there. Maria Glaimore and colleagues at UCSF have proposed a cluster randomized trial where you might be able to randomize when clusters of clinics choose to administer the drug, rather than leave it to individual patient randomization, which is not going to be possible. So I think there are several opportunities that we can now try and make use of, given the current circumstances we find ourselves in, and try and get these answers quickly and in as effective a manner as possible.
I would just add, a little bit more specificity on the CMS side. You may have heard, right, that CMS is undertaking the process of figuring out whether they should use a model called coverage with evidence development, rather than agreeing to pay for the product, every time it's prescribed for Medicare patients, saying we will pay only if you are enrolled in a clinical trial. And they're gathering input from patients and others about whether they should undertake this process, which is, relatively uncommon. The key thing here, and I mention this because it's another way to gather evidence about whether the product works more quickly than waiting for Biogen to do it on its own. I would suggest that if CMS proceeds with this coverage with evidence development process, that it really do so in the context of a rigorously designed, controlled clinical trial, rather than, something that would look like a registry where, yes, we will say, we're paying for this only if you're in a trial, but everybody can be receiving the product and we'll just be on a registry and we'll follow you. Doing this as a randomized trial in the context of kind of payment being offered or payment being withheld would be a way to encourage patients to participate in that study. Now, as an ethicist, maybe I should comment on whether it would be ethical to do a randomized, standard of care placebo-controlled clinical trial after we have FDA approval for this product. I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. We do not know whether this product works, and so it's not unethical to withhold it from patients. They may not appreciate that. They may have a preference for which arm of the trial they're ultimately randomized to be in. But we do clinical trials to figure out what works. And so it remains ethically appropriate to continue to randomize patients to Aducanumab versus placebo or alternatives. So if CMS proceeds with this coverage with evidence development process, which I really hope they will, I hope that they will take it to kind of its full potential and do a real study.
Thank you, everyone. There's also been a few questions kind of on the implications of the approval process and what this means for the future of the FDA. What efforts has there been to look at the lessons learned from this, and what does this mean for future Alzheimer's drugs?
Well, everyone loves this one. I mean, I think it's too early to tell how if this reflects an inflection point, as some have argued it does with respect to the FDA. Is there lasting damage? Does the FDA's reputation take a hit? I mean, it's easy to muse about all of these, but I think they're important but unanswerable questions. There's no question, though, that this has stimulated interest in most narrowly accelerated approval pathways using amyloid for further treatments for Alzheimer's disease, where we already see either actual applications or publicly facing statements from two firms that they're going to seek an accelerated pathway. I think it puts wind in the sails for Alzheimer's research. And some have argued that that is alone a justification for approval. And my reply is that the world you want to live in, where the standard to get a drug approved is whether or not it spurs drug development? I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that's the safety and effectiveness that we want to have assured when we wake up each morning and take our medicines. So. I think this will, there have been a lot of rippling effects in the drug development, R&D, venture markets. And I think we'll have to see over the next, series of months to year or two, sort of how this shakes out, partly based on what further regulatory measures may take place and to what degree payers and hospitals and health systems ultimately endorse or fail to endorse this drug at all.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, it's early days here to figure out what this is ultimately going to mean. I think it's very clear what it will mean for other Alzheimer's drugs that are trying to act on the same pathway. I mean, FDA would not have a leg to stand on to say that those products couldn't also use amyloid to support accelerated approval. I used to work in private practice as a lawyer representing pharmaceutical clients before the FDA. And so, I know that this is the kind of thing that lawyers say all the time, right? This is what you did for our competitor. You have to do the same for us, right? There is precedential value to FDA's decisions in that context. I have been thinking a lot, though, about how this particular decision fits in a broader narrative about what's been happening at FDA. And so, I don't know to the extent to which listeners on this call are familiar with the right to try movement, but for several years we had activity at the state level and then ultimately legislation passed at the federal level that was pushing for patients who were dying without alternative treatment options to be able to circumvent the FDA and ask companies for access to their drugs prior to FDA approval. That law has been, a complete dud. It has not actually gotten anybody meaningful access, but it reflects kind of a mindset about what we owe or what the government should do with regard to patients who have, who are dying with serious unmet treatment needs. And then along comes COVID, and we have the emergency use authorization pathway, which also obviously reduces the evidentiary standard because of, kind of desperate circumstances, saying we have patients who are dying, we have to get some drugs out there for them, right? And so FDA was really pressured to make use of that pathway, sometimes for good, sometimes, not so good. And then we have this Aducanumab decision, which, uses the accelerated approval pathway, but that has been around for a long time, but increasingly starts to look like FDA is adopting this right to try mindset, meaning, patients said they want it, we're going to step aside and let them have it. And that, I think, is a really serious concern about the future of the agency, not only with regard to Alzheimer's patients, but there are unfortunately, loads of, patients who have unmet treatment needs. And so if you listen to the ALS patient community, for example, they also want drugs that work. But they have a few products that they are excited about that FDA has told those manufacturers go back and do confirmatory trials. The neurology division, no less, right? So ALS patients are saying, how come Alzheimer's patients are getting access to something that might work and FDA is preventing us from getting access to something that might work. If that's the new standard, why aren't we all being treated, evenly? But I agree with Dr. Alexander that the, one major question will be, is it going to be a snapback effect where FDA says, okay, we've gone too far, we have to clamp down now, or are they going to continue on this trajectory of, really weakened standards?
We have a couple questions here about the adverse effects. So one, the risk of encephalopathy, how common it is relative to the benefits, and then how well are those adverse effects being tracked now that approval has been given?
So I'm not sure encephalopathy is a recognized adverse event. The most common adverse event is amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. And that refers to either reversible brain swelling or microhemorrhages. So there are two types of amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, E and H, E for edema and H for microhemorrhages. So E is the brain swelling and H is the microbleeds. These are fairly common adverse events. So in the phase 3 trials, the incidence of amyloid-related imaging abnormalities for the brain swelling component was about 34% in the drug arm compared to the placebo arm, 20% for microhemorrhages. And if you looked at these adverse events in patients with and without an ApoE4 allele, it was dramatically higher in ApoE4 carriers. So the incidence of ARIA increases to, I think, 43% in E4 carriers. Versus 20% in E4 non-carriers. So these are the most common side effects associated with the medication.
It's a big deal. And fortunately, in most cases, these are asymptomatic, but in a minority of cases, they're not. I believe it's about 10%, but I would refer to my colleague to correct me if I'm wrong. But keep in mind that the symptoms, the adverse effects, the symptoms are things like confusion, headaches, fatigue, memory impairment, trouble walking. And if any of this sounds familiar, it should, because these are also symptoms of progressive Alzheimer's disease in many patients. So I think it's going to be a real mess for clinicians and patients. It's going to be a mess that they're going to have to navigate together. And clearly MRIs are going to be vital here. But many, many patients may experience these symptoms. And again, while ARIA, these brain imaging abnormalities are typically asymptomatic. That is, patients aren't aware that they have the brain swelling or the microhemorrhage. In maybe 10% of cases, they are symptomatic, and in a much smaller number, they're severe. So I think this is important to keep in mind. As for their surveillance, no, the FDA did not institute a REMS, which is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. This is one of the important methods that the FDA has to help promote or presumably promote the safe use of medicines after approval. And the FDA declined to institute a REMS. REMS vary in terms of their comprehensiveness and their rigor. And from fairly simple, straightforward, historically they've included just a medication guide, just giving information to patients, say, about risks. Those are no longer part of the REMS program, but there are more aggressive REMS that can be used to promote the safe use of product, but that wasn't pursued here. And I think that ultimately this is going to come to clinicians, patients, family members, to really maximize the safe use of this product.
So one of the things we've repeatedly discussed tonight is kind of the cost of this. Can you all comment on what the impact this approval could have on the cost of prescription drugs paid for by Medicare, and what policies could control high costs like this drug that have controversial clinical effect?
This I mean, I'll just briefly mention that this is related to the challenge of responding to a patient willingness to try, right? It's not a costless decision, and it's not an individual, a decision that only impacts the individual. When you are asking for the use of a shared resource like Medicare money or insurance, private insurance funding, the question is, what else should not be paid for, or, whether it's other medical treatment or, at a federal government level, infrastructure, education, there's all sorts of other things that federal money can get spent on. And so here, you might have patients saying, well, we would like the opportunity to try this product and we want the government to pay for it. And so it becomes a really substantial resource allocation issue, right? Ethically speaking, you don't have a claim on a shared resource at all if you don't have evidence that the product works. And so I think that's why we're seeing this conversation around coverage with evidence development, of acknowledging that we really don't have the evidence we need to make that claim on a shared resource.
And I also think the 56,000 might be a significant underestimate, because you have costs associated with brain amyloid scanning, you have costs associated with interval MRI scans to monitor patients with ARIA. And you have add-on costs related to genotyping, if that's what you want to do to be able to present risk estimates for adverse events. So I think the actual cost might eventually pan out to be even greater than that number of 56,000 that's circulating.
Yeah, I think the cost, one thing to keep in mind is that the 56,000 is head and shoulders above a value-based cost estimated by the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review of, I know they revised it once, it's ballpark maybe 3,000 to 8,000. So those may not be the precise numbers, but that's the ballpark. And 3,000 to 8,000 is a world away from 56,000. I think the point is a good one, that the costs are not just for the product alone, and also the concern about equity and the fact that there may be for some patients as much as a 20% out-of-pocket cost. And you better believe that there are many, many millions of Americans that aren't walking around with $5,000 burning a hole in their pocket, ready to shell that out for this drug. So I think there's very real and serious concerns that that this is a product, whether or not you think it works and whether or not you think it's safe. I think one thing we can agree on is that we need to be sure that we're avoiding a system that's a two-tiered system where only the wealthy can afford to pay for this product and actually get it.
And just remember too, what I was saying before about the profit motives of the company. They did not have to price this drug at this level, right? It was a conscious decision to say we're going to charge, this exorbitant fee for something that we don't know works. And I hope it won't be lost on anyone listening in that we live in a country in which patients die for lack of access to insulin because they can't afford it. And we're talking about paying for a product that we don't know is effective and has these other very serious risks associated with it.
So I know we're over time here, but I'll do one last question before starting to wrap up here. So we have a question here. Has the 21st Century Cures Act impacted the accelerated approval process? And do you think Aducanumab would have been approved if this weren't enacted?
I thought you were going to ask us what gives us hope, which is a nice way to end on a positive note. And frankly, the galvanization of so many communities and stakeholders to understand what happened and how it happened and to prevent it from happening again gives me hope, as well as the efforts to be sure that we do right by our patients and their loved ones for this common and devastating disease. I don't think this is related to 21st Century Cures. I think this is a total, in many ways, an aberration, an outlier. It's so controversial and so consequential and so perplexing simply because, as I said at the outset, it's so contrary to the way that the FDA does business. Regardless of what someone might say otherwise, this was not the usual and customary process of drug approval. So, but I don't think it has a lot to do with 21st Century. And I would just thank you again for the opportunity to participate.
I agree with you that it's, there's nothing specific to 21st Century Cures that I think played a role here. but it might relate to the overarching mindset of 21st century cures, right? Which is get drugs out the door to patients as quickly as possible. And, there's no way that FDA can help being influenced by that message over and over and over again. And I also really enjoyed this conversation today. Thanks for having me.
And I'd just add, one closing note, and that is, personally, I've been, so struck by, the desperation of patients, the moving testimony that they gave, during the advisory committee meeting. And to my mind, it looks as if, that desperation and that hope that they have should inspire us to do the best possible science and not use it as an excuse to cut corners and lower standards. So to me personally, I think that's the big learning message that I've taken on board. And I think that's what I think should guide us moving forward.
Thank you, everyone. Does anyone else have any last closing thoughts here before we kind of start wrapping up? All right. So I wanted to close this lunch and learn session first by thanking our speakers, Caleb, Holly, Madhav. We're very grateful that you were all willing to take your time and spend your lunch with us here today. Just a couple quick reminders. This event will be available for viewing later on DFA's YouTube channel. Looks like Ali posted in the chat here. Please take a couple minutes to take our survey. We want to hear more from you all who attended and what you thought went well, what could be improved for our future sessions here. And then last reminder, please remember to follow us on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Stay up to date on other sessions we're doing like this and other advocacy opportunities. Thank you everyone for attending today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.